Alright, what is going on, guys? So today we are addressing the number one thing I see all beginner photographers struggle with, and that is capturing tack sharp photos. And honestly, this is so important to understand because it doesn't matter how well composed your photo is or how good the light is. If your photo is out of focus, then it's simply not usable. And as you start to dive into the post-production side of photography, you'll quickly realize that focus is the only thing we cannot fix within the editing room. So firstly, the two main reasons why your photos are not turning out sharp is because number one, blur is being caused from some type of motion, and number two, which is missing focus due to not using the correct focus mode. So to correct these two, we first need to understand that all cameras have at least 3 different focusing modes within them. So number one is autofocus single, also known as AFS. And this is the focus mode we use when shooting subjects that aren't moving. So things like products, landscapes, and architecture. Number two is autofocus continuous, also known as AFC. And this is the focus mode we use when shooting moving subjects. So things like cars, animals, and people. And number three is manual focus. So this is when we're in total control of setting the focus for our camera, and we can do this by twisting the focus ring on our lens. But with that being said, I personally don't use manual focus that much, but there are times where it can come in handy. So for example, when shooting through something, so let's say I'm shooting a portrait of a model through a fence or even a glass window. Another scenario could be when shooting in low light situations and where our camera's autofocus may struggle locking on. Now, the next camera setting we must be aware of to ensure we don't have any unwanted blur in our photos is shutter speed. So for those that don't know, shutter speed is this number that is displayed in the bottom left hand corner of your camera, and simply put, this controls the time it takes for your camera's shutter to open and close to capture an image. So that means the higher this number is, the quicker your camera will capture an image, and the lower this number is, the longer it will take. So depending on how fast you set your shutter speed, this will determine how much motion blur will be in your photos. So for example, if we take a look at this photo here, I shot this with the shutter speed of 1/1000 of a second, and as I zoom in, you can see that all the cars have been frozen and there's no motion blur. But now, if we take a look at this photo, I shot this with a shutter speed of 0.6 of a second, and here we can see a lot of motion blur from these passing cars. So this motion blur is appearing because the camera is capturing all the movement that is occurring during this 0.6 of a second. Alright, I know things just got a little technical, but the main thing to remember is higher shutter speed equals faster photo, and lower shutter speed equals slower photo. Okay, so now that we have a better understanding about the technical side of nailing your focus, let's discuss the 2 main scenarios that us photographers will find ourselves in and how we can ensure we capture them properly. So the 2 scenarios are still subjects, which again are things that are not moving. So for example, products, architecture, and landscapes. And then we have moving subjects. So again, that's things like people, animals, and cars. So let's discuss how to capture still subjects first. So still subjects seem pretty easy to shoot, and for the most part they are, but the main thing you need to be aware of is camera shake. So firstly, what is camera shake? And well, camera shake is when you accidentally cause your camera to shake as you take a photo. And this shake is the result of unsteady hands, incorrect grip, and pressing of the shutter button too hard when taking a photo. This camera shake will result in blurry images and generally occurs when using slower shutter speeds or when using heavier lenses. Some ways to easily combat camera shake is by using a tripod, a soft release shutter button, the correct grip of a camera, and a higher shutter speed. So as a rule of thumb for most cases, your shutter speed should be set to an absolute minimum of double your lens's focal length. So for example, if you are shooting with a 50mm lens, then your shutter speed should be set to a minimum of 1/100th of a second. If you're shooting with a 200mm lens, then your shutter speed should be set to a minimum of 1/400th of a second. Now, with that being said, these are the absolute minimum, and if the lighting conditions allow, I'd recommend using an even higher shutter speed. Now, regarding which focus mode to use for still subjects, I personally use and recommend the autofocus single, also known as AFS. Okay, now let's talk about capturing moving subjects. So this is where I see a lot of beginners struggle, and personally this was something I had to really focus on when I first started. But in terms of which focus mode to use when shooting moving subjects, I recommend using the continuous autofocus mode, also known as AFC. So when your camera is in the continuous autofocus mode, as long as you hold the shutter button down halfway, our cameras will constantly be updating the focus. So as you can see here, the focus is constantly staying on me as I move around the frame. And when it comes to moving subjects, their movements can be very unpredictable. So having the peace of mind that our camera will be able to track our subject will really allow us to focus on our compositions and exposure. Now, regarding what shutter speed to use for moving subjects, and well, this really comes down to what your subject is and how fast are they moving. So again, going back to the car example from before, I tested a shutter speed of 0.6 of a second, and as we saw, it was just way too slow. But then I tried a shutter speed of 1/1000 of a second, and that was enough to freeze our subjects. Another example is this photo here. I shot this at a shutter speed of 1/1000 of a second, and as we can see, I was able to freeze my subject in the air with no motion blur. So when you're out in the field, this may take some testing, but here are some recommended shutter speeds for different situations. So number one is minimum. So this is a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, and this is a good minimum number to start at, and it should combat any camera shake and cover most portrait shoots. But again, if the lighting situation allows, higher is always better. Next is great, and that consists of a shutter speed of 1/1000 of a second. And this should work for most street photography, but again, if the lighting situation allows, faster is better. And now lastly for sports. So I'd recommend using an absolute minimum of 1/2000 of a second, depending on the sport you're shooting. Again, these recommended shutter speeds are a great place to start, but it may take some trial and error depending on your subject. I know firsthand that shutter speed can be a pretty complex topic, but once mastered, we can start getting really creative with our photos, and we can start doing things like long exposures and panning photography. But with that being said, that is pretty much the secrets to getting sharp photos, and the main thing is to identify if your subject is either still or moving, and then setting the correct focus mode and shutter speed to capture that subject. Now, a bonus setting that can also assist you in capturing sharp photos is aperture. So I'm not going to go too into detail about it here, but aperture is this number in the middle here, and simply put, this controls the size of the opening within your lens for light to pass through. And aperture is usually represented as an f-stop number, so on lenses you may typically see f-stop numbers displayed in increments such as f1.4, f2.8, f5.6 and so on. And the main thing you need to remember about aperture in regards to focus is depth of field. Now you may be thinking, what is depth of field? And well, depth of field basically refers to how much of the image will be in focus. So for example, if you put your hand around 15 centimeters in front of your face and focus on the lines on your palm, you will start to notice that in your peripheral vision, everything around your hand is blurry and out of focus. So in photography, we call this a shallow depth of field, and it's the same type of effect a lens with a low aperture of something like f1.8 can produce. So depending on what your subject is, you may want to use a shallow depth of field where there'll be a nice smooth background blur, or you may want to use a deep depth of field to ensure as much of your image is in focus. So some photography examples of having a shallow depth of field could be when shooting portraits or product photography. And some examples of using a higher aperture like f11 and up could be when shooting landscapes, architecture, or even group photos. So with that being said, if you are setting the correct shutter speed and focus mode and you're still struggling to get tack sharp photos, then you could set a higher aperture like f8. So even if you slightly miss your focus when shooting your subject, we have a much higher chance of still producing a sharp image because our depth of field range is a lot larger. But there we have it. That is how you can capture tack sharp photos every time with any camera. And as always, thank you for making it this far in the video. And if you're interested in learning more things like this, I'm currently running a free photography training where I break down my top tips to capturing professional looking photos without the use of any expensive camera gear. In this free training, I also break down the 5 key steps I took to making over 6 figures a year as a full-time photographer. You can hit the link in the description below to register if interested. Also, I'll be posting a bunch of new videos to this channel, so if you want to stay up to date with all the new content coming, hit the like and subscribe button on your way out, and I'll see you next week.